Hey everyone, welcome back to Engelbard. For today's video, I'm going to be doing something a bit different and actually give back to the retro gaming community. Why? Because I'm not entirely an asshole. No, I'll be doing a series of tutorials on how to create Genesis music. Make that Sega Genesis music using Deflemask. So I originally put together the first few scripts for these tutorials quite a ways back, and I just hadn't gotten around to producing them yet. Not because I'm lazy, but because every time I looked at them, it looked like they just weren't quite achieving the goal that I wanted them to. And what is that goal? I want someone who knows nothing about the Sega Genesis or even music in general to go from that state to creating their own music that they can incorporate into actual Genesis games in the future after they've finished the whole series. I realized what was needed was a primer that explained how the Genesis's sound systems worked before we delved into actually creating music with them. In that spirit, you can consider this episode 0 of the tutorial, in which I'll give you a solid foundation to work from, which will help you understand the things we talk about later in future episodes.
And who am I to cover this stuff and tell you about these sound chips and make these tutorials? Well, I'm just some guy that's been making Genesis music for a little while now. Credentials-wise, I'm creating music for a few new Genesis games now, including some tracks for Pigsy's Castlevania Symphony of the Night remake. You can check out my music channel to see videos of those songs, along with a whole bunch of others. You can find the link up above and also down in the description.
Alright, enough about me. What we're going to cover today specifically is I'll introduce you to the Genesis sound chips, I'll explain what they are, how they work, what their special modes are, and I'll also give you your first glimpse of Deflemask. But please, don't be overwhelmed by anything you see here. I'm going to need you to stay fully whelmed for this one. Just bear in mind that everything we're going to discuss today is really just to get an overview on things, and I will go in depth on all the topics we discuss here today in future episodes.
This here thing is the Sega Genesis. You may know it as the megadrive in your home territory, or even the Game Boy or Super Aladdin Boy. Whatever it was called in your homeland, the innards are basically the same. Inside the Genesis we'll find two sound chips. They are the Yamaha YM2612 and the Texas Instruments SN76489. Newer models of the Genesis replace the YM2612 with the YM3438. For the purposes of today, we'll just call the 3438 a modified version of the 2612 with a few bug fixes. The Genesis is capable of playing sound from both its Yamaha and Texas Instrument chips simultaneously, and many games from its commercial lifetime do indeed use the two chips together. Let's go over what the YM2612's capabilities are first. The YM2612 is an FM synthesis chip. FM stands for frequency modulation. FM synthesis involves multiple operators working together to create a single complex sound. What the heck is an operator? If you want the technical definition, it's something that contains an oscillator with amplitude controlled by an envelope. Yeah, that's a mouthful. So, for now, just consider it a piece of the instrument's sound. In the case of the YM2612, its instruments use 4 operators. Some FM chips use fewer, other FM chips use more. You'd find FM chips in all kinds of electronics, notably musical keyboard synthesizers from the mid-80s and early 90s. The YM2612 has 6 FM channels. In other words, it can play 6 tones at one time, which is also known as 6-note polyphony. There are some exceptions to this rule, which I'll get into in just a bit. Now, you can create or edit instruments, referred to as patches, by messing around with a bunch of settings, or parameters. Once you know what you're doing, you'll be able to create instruments that in many cases sound relatively close to the real thing. Let's look at Deflemask for a moment as a visual aid. When you go to edit or create an instrument, you'll see this window. I know it can seem a bit intimidating to the uninitiated, but like anything else, once you learn what the things in here do, it's pretty simple to deal with. For now, I'm just using it to illustrate a few points on how sound works on the Genesis in general, so don't worry about memorizing anything. Here we can see each of the 4 operators for an instrument. Instruments are created by adjusting the parameters of each of these 4 operators like I just mentioned. Now the 4 operators work together with the algorithm you select. Algorithm? What is their math now? When it comes to Genesis FM music, just think of the algorithm as the base for your sound. There are 8 algorithms. Each one is suited to creating different types of sounds. For example, to create a nifty, realistic-sounding pipe organ, you'd use algorithm 7 and adjust the operators to get the tone you want. Like this. Neat, right? You can also control things like amplitude and frequency modulation sensitivity parameters to add some vibrato and control how pronounced it is. The YM2612 also has the capability of using feedback, which is super handy for creating good distortion guitars, or, somewhat surprisingly, realistic-sounding brass and pianos. Feedback only applies to operator 1. And all these little sliders over here control a lot of the basic synthesizer functionality for attributes like attack, decay, sustain, and release. I'm not going to give you technical definitions, but I will explain the practical results of changing these things. Now, attack is how fast the instrument fades in when a note starts playing. It can range from immediate to a very slow fade in. Decay is how quickly the sound sort of shrinks away. Sustain is basically how long it will hold at maximum volume. Release controls sort of the fade out of a note and is kind of the opposite of attack. You can adjust all of these settings on each of the 4 operators. Well, that might seem like a lot of stuff we just covered. And it is, really. But the key takeaway here is that just know that you can adjust sounds by playing around with a bunch of sliders to create a huge variety of instruments. If you've made it this far, good job for sticking around. I'll reward you with a picture of one of my cats. Now let's move on. The 6th FM channel is special. This channel can be used either for FM sound like I've been talking about, or it can be used for the DAC, or digital to analog converter. Ooh, sounds fancy, right? All the DAC does is play real recorded or sampled audio. For the Genesis, samples were most often used for recorded voice, for digital sound effects, or for percussion in music like drums and cymbals. The Genesis can handle samples recorded at up to 32 kHz, or 32,000 Hz. The frequency, or hertz or kilohertz in this case, basically determines how clear and how high quality the sample will sound. So you might be wondering, why didn't the developers just use samples for all the music or entire music tracks back in the day? Well, my musically inclined retro gaming friends, that's because samples are large and take up a lot of space, especially when most, now that's most, not all, Genesis cartridges we were dealing with back then were between 512 kilobytes and 3072 kilobytes. In other words, they were from half of 1 megabyte to about 3 megabytes. I mean, just think about that for a second. You can have a high-quality 2-minute MP3 today that's actually larger than the entire game of Phantasy Star 4. And then an uncompressed WAV file is usually 10 times that size. So the point here is that sample use had to be limited. To work within these limits, samples were often lower frequency, like 11 or 16 kilohertz. Now if you want to make Genesis music today, you don't really have the same limitations that musicians back in the day did, so really, you can go crazy with a ton of high-quality samples if you want. The thing is, though, if you intend to put your music into an actual game or cartridge someday, without going to ridiculously huge cartridge sizes, you'll generally want to limit the size of your samples in order to keep your music files smaller, just like in the good old days. It's also noteworthy that FM Channel 6 cannot play FM tones and a sample at the same time. It's one or the other. You basically have to tell it which mode it's in. With modern drivers like the XGM sound driver, the Genesis can play up to 4 samples simultaneously, with each one limited to 14 kHz. As a side note, at least as of the time of me recording this video, Deflemask does not support XGM music, but you can still create your song in Deflemask, import it into a cartridge as XGM, and then play digitally sampled sound effects on top of that music. Now let's discuss one more special mode, Extended Channel 3 mode. Remember when I said that the YM2612 was limited to 6-note polyphony? Well, that was a dirty lie. At least, sort of. Extended Channel 3 mode allows the YM2612 to break FM Channel 3 into each of its 4 operators and play their corresponding sounds individually. You might be thinking, hey, that's great, you can change one channel into 4. Well, not so fast there, buddy. Those algorithms I mentioned before that control the type of sound you get, when it comes to Extended Channel 3 mode, they're super important. You see, some of those algorithms basically link some of the operators together in unique ways. As an example, let's say you want to use algorithm 7. In that algorithm, you can play all 4 operators individually with different notes and effects at the same time. There are certain limitations to effects though, primarily when it comes to the individual stereo assignments on each of the 4 operators. Anything on channel 3 will share the same stereo state. If we look at algorithm 6, it links operators 1 and 2 together, and then 3 and 4 are independent. So in this mode, if you want to have quote-unquote normal sounds, you basically have to play the same note at the same time in operators 1 and 2, and then you can have individual notes accompanying those in operators 3 and 4. Other algorithms work differently. Now don't worry, I'm not going to break your brain today by going into this any deeper. Just keep in mind that what you can do in Extended Channel 3 mode depends on the algorithm you use, and no matter which algorithm you select, the individual tones that you can play in each operator won't sound like a complete instrument. They'll be much more limited. But they're still useful in situations where extra polyphony is required more than higher quality sounds. Alright, time to wade into the controversial stereo. If we look at the Sega Genesis, it says right on the thing that it supports stereo sound. And it does. But some audiophiles might jump down my throat on this one, and to them I say, get out of there! But seriously, the way stereo works on the Genesis is that each FM channel can have 3 states: left speaker only, right speaker only, or left and right speakers together. You can change this as many times as you want on the fly anywhere in the music track. So yeah, I'm sticking with calling it stereo like it says right there on the system. And for now, that really covers the most basic aspects of the YM2612 and what it does. I haven't touched on the finer details like the tons of effects you can apply, but I'm going to save all that for where it's more relevant in forthcoming Deflo Mask tutorial episodes. Still with me? Great, here's another one of my cats. Now, let's talk about the other sound chip in the Genesis, the Texas Instruments SN76489. It's known as a PSG, or Programmable Sound Generator. It's a much simpler chip than the YM2612. And ready to have your mind blown? This is the same sound chip that was in the ColecoVision. Sega used it in their first game system, the SG-1000, and stuck with it for the Mark III and Master System. Then they included it in the Genesis primarily for the purposes of retaining backwards compatibility with Sega Master System games. But Sega also went the extra mile by allowing it to play music at the same time as the YM2612. Swell, right? Before we get into the specifics of the SN76489, in general, I'd say it's okay. If we compare it to, say, the SID chip in the Commodore 64, the 489 has one more sound channel than the SID chip. But that doesn't tell the whole story. Most importantly, the SID chip is a vastly more capable chip with great synthesis capabilities that the SN here lacks. If we compare it to the NES's sound chip, the SN has fewer channels, fewer envelopes, and no PCM channel. It's not a bad chip, it's just a relatively simple and limited one. I mean, there's way worse out there, believe me. The SN76489 has 4 sound channels. It has 3 square wave tone channels and 1 noise channel. What's a square wave? Well, these are. It can play up to 3 of those at the same time. You can also apply some simple effects like vibrato, volume control, and arpeggios to shake things up with a little variety. The 4th channel is a noise channel. This was typically used for percussion or sound effects like punches, explosions, and that kind of stuff. Now there are a few special things to note about this sound chip also. The noise channel can operate in two different modes. It's got a limited range mode and a full range mode. In the limited range mode, you can only play 3 different notes of noise. What? Only 3? Why would anyone use that mode? Well, because that's the only way you can use all 3 square wave channels simultaneously. If you enable the full range mode, then you can't use the 3rd square wave channel at the same time that noise notes are playing in channel 4. Well, I mean, technically you can, but it'll screw up how the noise sounds, so you wouldn't want to. So then how about the opposite? Why would you ever want to use full range if it limits the amount of square wave channels you can use? Well, in terms of Genesis music especially, with full range noise mode, you can use really high notes to create some fairly realistic sounding percussion, like hi-hats or shakers, like this. Also, as far as noise goes, the chip can create 2 types of noise. Standard white noise, which sounds like this, and periodic noise, which sounds like this. And then one final note about the SN76489. It only outputs mono sound, so you're stuck with no stereo effects of any kind on any of its 4 channels. And really, that about covers it for the SN76489. In terms of Genesis music, basically adds a few more channels of simpler audio to the 6 FM channels that are already there on the YM2612. This allowed the Genesis to technically be able to have 10-note polyphony. But that's not quite the whole story now, is it? If you use Extended Channel 3 mode with Algorithm 7 and the XGM driver, you can play a whopping 17 sounds simultaneously. And for samples, if you want to get super creative, you can record samples on top of each other if you know they'll be playing at the same time, which will extend that 17 sounds to even more. The Genesis's overall sound system is really quite capable and can create some fantastic music despite the bad press it's gotten, particularly in the internet age. Musicians today are really unlocking its full potential and putting out some incredible stuff. And you know what? You'll be able to do that too, even if you're brand new to it, once you learn a few things. You might want to know why exactly the Genesis has such a bad reputation for sound. Well, it's probably mainly because of games that sound like this. Yes, Western-developed games for the system have a terrible reputation when it comes to sound. Many of these games use the GEMS system, which allowed developers to quickly and easily create music. The problem was that they used a lot of the pre-built sample instruments that were in there, and didn't really tweak things in any way, which led to a lot of games sounding bad, and kind of bad in the same way. I mean, just listen to some of these games that came out years before some of the ones I just showed you. Kind of a tragedy, isn't it? Anyway, the point of all this is, the Genesis's sound hardware is not bad. Like with any tool, it's all how you use it. And with that, I think it's time to end this little primer. We've covered what the YM2612 FM chip is and what it does, and we've covered what the SN76489 PSG chip is and what it does. Now you know the basics, and when I launch the first Deflemask tutorial, you'll have a good understanding of how things work in general, which will let us jump into things faster. Let me know any questions you have about any of this stuff in the comments. Is there anything specifically you want to see in my Deflemask tutorials? Let me know that too. I've already got a whole bunch of what I'm going to cover planned, but in the end, these tutorials are for you, so I don't want to leave anything out that people might be interested in. That'll do it for this video, my retro gaming friends. If you enjoyed the video, please toss it a like and share it. If you haven't yet, then hey, subscribe and hit that notification bell so you'll know when the tutorials come out. Also, I just recently launched Patreon and Ko-fi pages, so if you want to support my work, I'd really appreciate it. With that, I'll say thanks for watching, and see me later.